Hello, I'm Sschrader, and I'm a Libertarian presidential candidate. In the introductory videos for this series, I pointed out that my primary advantage over all of my opponents is my professional background as a counterintelligence analyst. Now, the difference between a CI analyst and a normal analyst is that the CI analyst concentrates on taking a deliberately contrarian perspective to the information that a normal analyst does. For example, when doing an analysis of an opponent's capabilities, an analyst will always break down and analyze their capabilities. What can they do? However, a counterintelligence analyst, i.e. me, I analyze their weaknesses. Now, today, the Chinese economy is the wonder of the modern world. The future's Chinese. I mean, really. They've got the fastest growing economy, and they're going to be overtaking us soon to become the world dominant. I can remember back in the late 70s and early 80s when the model for the future was Japan, and Japan was going to have the strongest economy in the world. However, they expanded too quickly, ran up too much in debt as they expanded, creating a giant economic bubble that popped, and they're still trying to get back to where they really started as it goes in the world as the economy. China, well, they've expanded even further, and being a much larger economy, they've created possibly the largest economic bubble in history. For example, for the last decade, the Chinese GDP growth has averaged somewhere between 7 and 9% a year. Meanwhile, Chinese debt has quadrupled over the same period, mainly because they're pushing their expansion with their centrally planned economy based on government banks making up virtually unlimited, very good rate loans to government-owned and controlled corporations. It's reached the point of where those companies are now borrowing more money to make the payments on their previous debts. That is a recipe for disaster. And you can see it starting to appear. And by the way, the Chinese premier knows what's coming. And that's where it gets scary. You see, the Chinese bubble is about to pop, which is why China has been so circumspect in handling the protests in Hong Kong. Hong Kong's the crown jewel of the Chinese economy. And that all goes away if they pull a Tiananmen Square. By the way, when they did crush the opposition protests in Tiananmen Square, it triggered a recession for them, a heavy one. This time, it could cause a depression. So that's why they're hesitant about going in, stopping things in Hong Kong. Now, I just said that the Chinese premier knows what's going on. When you're dealing with a communist or totalitarian government, you have to pay attention to the signals they send. And the last major Chinese military parade, communist countries love doing giant military parades, and so do dictatorships. Well, rather than being held in Beijing, this one was held at a remote military base way out in Inner Mongolia. In other words, it wasn't for the Chinese people, it was for the premiers letting the other people in the government know that he's the boss. You see, Chinese military is a very peculiar circumstance. Unlike any other country in the world, when Mao set up the Communist Chinese government, he made the army, the Chinese People's Army, swear an oath not to the people of China, not to the Chinese government, but to the Chinese Communist Party. and in particular its premier, which was him, a personal oath by the Army to him. And this last parade the premier put on way out in the middle of nowhere was to remind other people in the government about this. The reason is that over the last several years, he has claimed full credit, personal credit, for all the good times. Well, if you own the good times, you also have to own the bad times. And if the bubble bursts, well, there are people waiting in the wings to replace it. Now, what this means is that, well, there's an old Chinese curse that goes, may you live in interesting times. And times are about to get real interesting in China. And since they have such a huge economy that's tied in with so many other economies around the world, it's going to be an interesting time for everybody. So I may be the only candidate in the race that's actually working on researching and developing what we should do when when the Chinese bubble bursts. Now, if you want to see other videos in this series, you can either go to my campaign website, Sschrader, Schrader, for president, the number 2020.com, or you can go to YouTube and type in Sschrader, spelled the way I did before, with a separate word, campaign, or you can follow me on Twitter, Stephen, spelled with a PH, Sschrader. And goodbye.